Hi, everybody. My name is Tanya Hayles. I am located in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. It is gray and cold, but that's February in Toronto, so no surprises there. Really excited to be here to chat with you in regards to anti-Black racism, DEI, and all of these terms that we've been talking about for the last 2 to 3 years. I know some folks are like, why are we still talking about this? And how come we haven't been able to move the needle? So I want to take a little bit of a different approach. I come back from a background of event planning, which means I didn't really have a very corporate life, a corporate job, a very 9 to 5 office wear kind of life. I really came from something that was very free flowing, very creative. And so that's the approach that I take to any type of conversation that I'm having about this. So we're going to use real world examples, real life examples, because I think at the end of the day, you cannot change a company without really impacting and imparting change onto the people. Because you are more than just being an employee at where you work. You are a mom, you're a dad, you're a brother, sister, you're a hockey player, you're a hobby enthusiast. There's so many more parts to you. And so if you're able to really consider anti-Black racism, diversity, equity, inclusion in your everyday day-to-day life, that makes the work more real and more relatable. So we're going to start off with a very simple question. How does anti-Black racism show up? Well, anti-Black racism, I call it a global brand because it is, unfortunately. Every culture on the planet and every institution on the planet has some sort of anti-Black racism embedded in it, right? If I were to travel to the other side of the world, in certain cultures, the darker skin that you are, the lower class that you're seen as. And so you're treated poorly. And when I talk about institutions, I talk about everything from medicine to retail, education, policing, tech. And I'm going to give some examples to that. So really, it's really important to think in terms of when people say, oh, well, just hire more Black people or put more Black people on the board, and there, your diversity and equity and inclusion problem is solved. But unfortunately, there's way more to that. It's an systemic issue, it's an institutional issue. And that's why it's so pervasive and it's so hard to solve, because it's not something that was built and born overnight. It took a really long time to get here, and therefore it's not going to be something that's dismantled overnight. And it is not something that is reliant upon just one person. It really is a collective thing that we all have to come together, both Black and white and other groups and other cultures, to dismantle the systems that let this thing kind of keep fostering and growing. So I said I was going to give some real life examples about where and how anti-Black racism shows up. So medicine. Black maternal health, specifically in the United States of America, is a pretty hot topic of conversation. Why? Because considering, the US is a world superpower, Black women die at really high rates, either during the childbirth and labor process or postpartum. And the reason for that is, unfortunately, within the medical sphere, so this is doctors, nurses, et cetera, they see Black women as superhuman. We're seen as our pain is not what we say that it is, that we're able to withstand higher levels of pain. And so we're not provided the drugs to help, counteract the pains and the things that we're experiencing. And I think to a specific case like Serena Williams, one of the most well-recognized Black women on the planet, and even her, in her labor and delivery, had challenges. And, for an athlete who knows her body pretty well, was still, had to push back against the medical staff to get the support that she needed. And so if Serena Williams, a very rich and wealthy, famous Black woman, is having that problem, what do we think is happening to the lower income, the new immigrant, the Black woman whose first language is not English? What do we think is happening to her? Those exact same things. And unfortunately, it leads to, the situations that we're having and that we see in the United States of America. So much so to the point where President Biden designated a week in April to Black maternal health because it's that big of an issue. Retail. One of the examples I like to use is H&M. Now, you may have heard of this, you may not, but a few years ago, there was an ad campaign that went viral. It had two little boys, one Black boy, one white boy. The little Black boy was wearing a hoodie that said, "Coolest monkey in the jungle." Now, if there had been Black people in the room in some way, at some point in the process of concept to the photo shoot to publishing, maybe someone would have said, hey, monkey is something that is thrown at Black children and grown Black men on the soccer pitch and football fields everywhere. Maybe we should just switch the hoodies. And even more important than saying there should have been Black person in the room or in one of the rooms at one of the stages, a person who would have been able to speak up and say, this is not a good idea. Because we'll speak to later in this workshop, just what the cost of all that was to H&M. Education, I'm here in the city of Toronto. The Black population for our city is around 11%. But there's an unfortunate statistic that says almost half of all Black students in the Toronto District School Board will be suspended by the time they graduate high school. Which means if I had two children, the chances of one of my kids being suspended would be really high. And considering what we are to the population of Toronto, that's really disheartening. And so it shows that there's bias, whether it's by the teachers, the administrators, the board itself, there's bias against Black girls and boys in the education system. Policing, we've all heard and seen so many cases and instances of biases and racism in the police industry, so I won't speak to that a lot because I know it can get pretty heavy. But I am going to move to something that is more day-to-day, tech. Now you're probably thinking, how could there be anti-Black racism in tech? Where could that possibly show up? Hands, more specifically, hand washing. And I know you're thinking, where is this going? I don't understand. So a lot of our tech tools are becoming automated, right? You go to the mall, you go to a restaurant, you put your hands underneath the water fountain and the water comes out. Except for oftentimes, because of my darker skin, I'm doing this. I'm tapping the top, the sides. I'm trying to see, how do I activate this tap? And sometimes it's a faulty thing for sure. But the problem is oftentimes these tech tools that are being created, whether it's software or hardware, because there are few Black people in the beta stage testing, et cetera, they're not testing on Black skin. So they're not making sure that everyone could equally wash their hands. So in your day-to-day, do I have daily encounters with the police? No, but I'm washing my hands every day. And hopefully you are too. And so those are just small ways that anti-Black racism can show up for anybody in their day-to-day lives. So the question I'm often asked is, how do we make this conversation real and relatable? Well, first by realizing anti-Black racism isn't an individual problem, as I mentioned before, so it cannot be solved that way. And I like using real world examples like H&M and like hand washing, because those are things that we have passed or shopped at or follow on socials. So this is where it becomes taking it out of the workplace and bringing it home with you, talking to your kids about it when you pick them up from school. How was your day? It's February. What are they learning about Black History Month? Is there something that has piqued their interest? Is there something that you can find that might pique their interest? For instance, did you know that a Black man created the Super Soaker? I bet you if you have kids and you told them that story, they'd be like, wow, that's cool, and maybe learn a little bit more. Draw the lines and the parallels between what you're naturally curious about and passionate about, you and your children and those in your household, and apply a Black lens to it. That's you doing Black history, teaching without having to delve into the deep, heavy topics of police and slavery. You don't have to go that deep and that far in order to make the conversation happen, and know that this is a conversation that you can happen year round. I know that it's easy because all the bookstores put Black authors up front in February It's easy to find Black creators, Black-owned stores in February. I know it takes a little bit more extra time and more work to find us, probably in August or later in the fall, but it is important to have this conversation every day, year round. The same for all groups, Indigenous, Asian, LGBTQ, right? Pride is not just one month of the year, it's year round. So it's important to really try and figure out ways that you can incorporate this into your day-to-day and make sure that it becomes a full year-long conversation. So I'm also asked quite often, I should say, how can you speak to your organization about anti-Black racism and DEI? Well, in the past 3 years, chances are your organization has either already started having conversations, has hired new directors or folks in the DEI space, has brought in consultants, you've done workshops, maybe you had a reading book club. There's been all sorts of different activities that we've seen happen in a lot of organizations in the past 3 years. But if you are working for an organization that's really small and feels like, this is not something that we want to take on or have the capacity to take on, you have two things that you have to do. First, you have to figure out if it's a safe space to do so. If you are Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, it is very hard to bring up these things because it is very easy for you to be labeled as a troublemaker and not being part of the culture fit and a whole lot of other words that are code for you're making us uncomfortable and we don't like it. So if it's not a safe place for you to do so, then maybe you don't. And the responsibility shouldn't be on the employee, it should be on the employer. The leadership should be the one to say, this is an important topic because it impacts our consumers, our customers, our clients, and us as an organization. And we'll get to a little bit later about the actual ROI of DEI inside a workplace. And the second thing is find an ally. Now, I tend to not like the word ally because right now it's a title people are giving themselves. It's kind of like giving yourself a gold star. An ally is someone who is doing the work. They're lifting as they climb, they're stepping aside, they're making sure that other voices are amplified and invited into rooms. If you are doing all that work silently, then you are an ally. And it's up to a cultural group or a group of people to give you that title. It's not one that you bestow upon yourself. So if there's someone internally that you see is always trying to make sure that you get heard in the business meeting and that they're just like, hey, I heard about this opportunity and, oh, you should come with me to this networking thing, that's an ally. And borrow that person when you go to speak to your higher ups to say, I want to start having more conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, and make sure that that person's in the room. And it's not to use them as like a shield per se, but it is a way of protecting yourself, especially if you are Black, Indigenous, a person of color, and throwing on the intersection of a woman alongside that. Does every industry need DEI training? Yes. As I've mentioned before, anti-Black racism touches every institution on the planet. But the problem is it's more than just training. It requires an overhaul of entire systems. And that is much more daunting, much more expensive, and much harder. And that's why a ton of organizations, companies are not comfortable and really don't want to make that effort. They're just like, how do we overhaul the entire retail space? How do we overhaul the entire education space? I totally understand. It is really overwhelming. But research has found that most workplace diversity programs fail to produce meaningful DEI work, and some have actually increased bias among individual employees because unfortunately, the responsibility is falling to the wrong folks. It's falling to the people on the ground. And while the people on the ground, when they're collective, have a really powerful voice, if they're fragmented, it's not as powerful. And when the CEO of a company says to do something, everyone shows up, or at least they try to. That's leadership at work. That is starting the work of DEI in a workplace. I once read a statistic that an economist found that the cost of racial bias is $16 trillion. That's a lot of zeros. My mind cannot fathom $16 trillion. And when we say the cost of racial bias, that is employees having to take sick days, having to use their mental health days if they have them, having to activate their health benefits because the workplace is so toxic, losing out on pay because they don't have paid time off. There's a huge cost. It's financial, it's physical, it's mental and emotional, and it's not just affecting your Black coworkers or your Indigenous or your other coworkers of color. Just think about it. If we're in a small team and I have a role and you have a role, but I'm not able to show up, I'm feeling like I'm not supported, I'm going through microaggressions at work, then I'm not putting in my fair share on that particular project. Now you have to lift me up and do some of my work, which is now putting more burden on you and probably resentment just to get the job done. So it's not just about how it affects the Black employees, it's about how it affects everybody. There are 4 core benefits of DEI. There's increased revenue and productivity. There's innovation, right? Think about the hand washing tech thing that I just spoke about. If there's more folks who have different lived experiences, different cultures, different backgrounds, able to give their input from the ground up, think of the innovations that'll take place. Higher employee satisfaction. And we all know that happier employees, they stay at the job longer, they're more loyal to the workplace, they're more likely to do extra things, volunteer, show up, take on extra projects, and improved company reputation. And that's a big one in this day and age, right? We have social media, there's Glassdoor, there's a ton of platforms that say, this is not a safe place for Black people to be. This is not a safe environment for white women to be. There's no white women in leadership. There's no Black people in leadership, right? Now we're examining these things and people are using this as a means to say, I'm not even gonna apply there. So you want your company to have a good reputation for employees and also to your customers and your clients. The main risk of ignoring DEI aligns exactly with that. Reputational risk and image management. Damaged awards, class action suits, stock price drops, product and service boycotts are just some of the fallouts from organizations that do not have strong diversity policies and programs. I'm going to go back to H&M. So I told you how it went viral. Well, what was the result of it? They had to close stores. They lost 24% of their stock market in the first 24 hours of it going viral. They're now a business case study. And they had a lot of reputational damage. People in the Black community, Black parents who, of course, buy hoodies for their Black children, were like, oh, well, if that's what they think of us and that's what they see us and they're not thinking of us from the planning onset, then why should I shop there? All of those things came from just one picture that could have been prevented if there had been, again, diversity and inclusion from the foundation, but also a voice for those folks. Another statistic that might stand out to you, approximately 55% of professional women surveyed by Me Too at work are less likely to apply for a job, and 49% are less likely to buy products or stock from a company with a public Me Too allegation. So these things are leading to dollars. There's a direct connection between if you are not thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it goes beyond anti-Black racism, and I know that that's why I'm here, but it goes to gender equity. It goes to all of these things together that will lead to employees not want to work there and people not wanting to shop there. So it's really important to think about, okay, how can I show up, right? You're just like, Tanya, I'm one person. I can't dismantle a whole system. I'm not the CEO of a company. How do I do this? Where do I start? What can I do? And I totally understand the apprehension and the questions. And some of you have already started doing the work. You're here, you're listening to me talk. So that's a good start for sure. But I think one thing that's really important is you always have to start with why. Shout out to Simon Sinek. That is a great place to start. Why is this important to you? Beyond the dollar signs, is it important to you because you want a better workplace environment for yourself, for your employees, for your coworkers? Do you want to just better yourself? Maybe you're a parent and you want to teach DEI to your children. You're your child's first teacher, so it's really important to be, the leader in your household to say, we're going to read books by Black authors in February. We're going to watch shows that center Black characters in February, or we're going to do it in April, or we're going to do it in November. We're really going to amplify. We're going to look at how do we show up when the next time you're in a meeting, whether it's virtual or in person, who's doing the most speaking? Who doesn't get a chance to say a word edgewise and say, hey, like, I remember you and I were talking in the hallway about this. Did you want to bring up that point that you had mentioned before? Give them an opportunity to be on that platform and share their voice. That's super important. There's small ways that you can incorporate DEI and anti-Black racism, and it's a practice, and it's a lifelong practice. This is lifelong education. This is lifelong conversations. It's not one day, it's not 1 month, it's not one person, but you as an individual can do things in your own personal life, thinking through who you're reading, who you're talking to, who you're amplifying, what questions are you asking, and hopefully that will start to move the needle in your workplace, but more importantly, at home and in any other environment that you find yourself in. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my workshop and session today. I'm happy to take some questions. I noticed in the chat that there are a couple of them in there. So let me see what these are all about. What does meaningful DEI training look like in corporate spaces? And how do we avoid performative gestures? Oh gosh, I could talk about performative gestures for a really long time. So we know that a ton of companies, what they did a couple of years ago was put up a Black square. That was their way of showing solidarity with the Black community, without doing much, without saying much. It was the safest possible way to say, we support the Black community, but we don't want to anger our white shareholders and our white customers who maybe feel differently about that, right? And so you have to think in terms of the people who saw those Black squares, your Black consumers, your Black clients, your Black customers, all they saw was a performative action that didn't do anything, didn't say anything, and they're not going to engage with you, right? So you have to really talk to people and say, how can we do this, right? How can we actually show up? When I talk about diversity in tech, one of the events that I'm most proud of being associated with in my former event planning days is Afrotech. Started out as 400 people in 2016, and now it's over 25,000, and just a few short years later. And what's really key and important there is people say, well, why is Afrotech necessary? Why do we need a tech company or a tech conference for just Black people? But think about all the Black engineers and the Black CMOs and the Black CTOs who never get the chance to see anybody else that looks like them. And what I love about it now is tech companies go to that conference in droves. They show up. They show up with job offers. They show up with sponsorship dollars. They show up to say, this is important. We're in the tech space. We're always saying there's a pipeline problem. We're going to go to where the pipeline is. We're going to break the pipeline open and make sure that folks have an opportunity to show up as employees for us. So those are some ways, really just, again, it doesn't have to be this big, you don't have to read the whole entire 1619 project, I promise you. I haven't even started it because it's a tome and it's heavy and it requires a lot of work and practice to get to that point. Let's just really start with small ways. Do you have Black ERGs, employee resource groups? Do you have safe spaces for your people of color in your organizations to gather? Do they have the ability to say to you, this is a bad idea? I don't think we should do this because my community, which is very loud on social media or on TikTok or Twitter or whatever it is, will show up and can lead to detrimental results for your organization. Just reading through the comments as well. Yes, thank you, Bess, for that comment about digital cameras. Yeah, everything that we think about that is so easy and defaults, it doesn't default for our skin. One of the stories I tell most often about founding Black Moms Connection is sunscreen. Most sunscreen I end up looking like this, right? It doesn't blend into white skin. I had to find a sunscreen that is designed for Black skin because we are not considered the default market and target demographic for sunscreen users, but we still need it. The sun is still hot. You know, our melanin doesn't fully protect us the way that we grew up thinking that it does. So it's those small ways that you can think, okay, well, make sure that when I'm launching a new product, that your focus group is diverse. You know, really making sure that you build in DEI from the very beginning. I think that's all the questions that are in the chat for me. Feel free to reach out. My email is hello@tanyahayles.com. If you have any other questions that you didn't get an opportunity to ask, weren't able to watch this in real time, and you're watching this after the fact, after you've put the kiddos to bed, after you've made dinner, absolutely happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you so much, Power to Fly, for having me here today, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Tanya. That was so powerful, so informative. And just, it's just so important, right? To like, we got to be in the room, you know, whatever, people have to be in the room. If it's working in a vacuum, if it's performative, it's not going to work. It's going to backfire. And you're going to lose 25%. What was it like? It was just like crazy.
Yeah, that's, I know that H&M probably opened the stock market the next day and that had to go through so many approvals, right?
Yeah,
like,
had to go through so many channels for something that like anyone, you know, we see that, you're like, what? Like, how could that possibly have been approved? And yet it was, and yet it was. And it's fascinating that, like, you know, it was a huge, horrific gesture that was just blind, you know, just wasn't aware. And it's amazing to me too. It's like, it's such a, like you said, it's a case study, right? Like one sweater on one child can do that. Because it's not just one sweater on one child, right? Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So thank you so much for that, and just like, and all of your tips and making the time today. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mom, making the time for us. I appreciate you. So we hope to have you back. Everyone go check out Tanya's chats, you know, and Google her, and there's so many great resources online. So, and I will be rewatching your chat with us because I learned so much. So thank you again.
Thank you for having me. Have a great rest of day.
Okay, you too.